So my name is Stuart Russell. I'm professor of computer science at UC Berkeley. My general area is artificial intelligence. And right now I'm mainly focused on the problem of control. So how do we retain control over increasingly intelligent AI systems? So this is an idea, a diagnosis for what everyone is aware of, which is that social media seem to have driven lots of people into a politically polarized state. If you think about that from the point of view of the people designing the content selection algorithms, the ad selection algorithms that choose what it is you're going to see, you might think, well, okay, they know that it doesn't make sense to send you stuff you're not interested in, so we just do some kind of learning algorithm that learns what you're interested in, and then it starts sending you more of that. But if you have an AI system, for example, a reinforcement learning algorithm, which is designed to optimize an objective, and here the objective is click-through, right? What fraction of the things that we send you do you click on, because that way you make ad revenue and so on, then that's not the solution. Just sending you stuff you like is not the best way to maximize revenue. The best way to maximize revenue is to modify you into someone who's more predictable. Because the more predictable you are, the higher percentage of things that I send you, you're going to click on. So a simple reinforcement learning algorithm would learn how to do that by sending you content that is, let's say, a little bit more extreme than your current political views. And then if you see enough of that, your political views will become a little bit more extreme. And then this process iterates until you're way at one end or the other end of the spectrum. We might say the neo-fascist end or the Berkeley end. And then, you know, when you're an extremist, you're very predictable, and we can generate more revenue from you. And so this was probably completely inadvertent. I don't think Facebook set out to do these things. And it may not even be explicit in the code, but in the combination of the code plus the way the marketing departments function, right? The revenue generation departments, how they continually modify the algorithms and so on. So some combination of these things effectively operates as a radicalizer for billions of people. And at the same time, then, you know, whole industries have sprung up to feed these newly arrived extremists with more and more content. I think so. So the objective of maximizing click-through in the short term is possibly not really the objective that Facebook should have been optimizing. And even though the algorithms are fairly stupid, I mean, they don't even know that human beings exist, let alone that human beings have political opinions, but they're still very effective because of the way they can customize and adjust the feed to the way you're responding to that feed and gradually move you one direction or the other. That's an unexpected consequence, and we didn't want to break up NATO or destroy Western democracy, but we kind of did. That's what happened. If you had systems that were much more intelligent than that, and you gave them even more innocuous objectives, you still might have these major catastrophic consequences. So the upshot is to really ask the question, is this the right way to build AI systems? That we create this optimizing machinery, which can be incredibly effective, and then we simply download an objective, and then off they go. Because if we don't specify the objective correctly, then the consequences can be arbitrarily bad. Well, I think it is a bit of a misconception. I mean, it's a valid point that intelligent humans who have your best interests at heart can understand when you ask for something, you know, incorrectly, right? They, you know, if you ask your assistant to, okay, book this conference room for a meeting at this time, you know, it's quite reasonable for your assistant to say, but you're already booked for that time, right? So the request that you made is not actually the right request. You gave the wrong objective, but the assistant has your best interests at heart, let's say. And so the question is, how do you make sure that this super intelligent AI system has your best interests at heart? And that's the unstated assumption here. What if it doesn't, right? What if we didn't manage to get it sort of constitutionally obliged to keep your best interest at the center of what it does? Then even if it does understand what you want, it's under no obligation to actually help you carry that out, right? And that's sort of that's the missing piece. So there's really, I mean, it's an old idea. Nick Bostrom calls it the orthogonality thesis, that you could have arbitrary intelligence connected with any objective. You know, and you can have a chess program that plays ordinary chess really well, or you could say, you know, I want you to play suicide chess, and I'll now play suicide chess really well, right, where you have to lose all your pieces. And so you can, you know, with a self-driving car or an Uber, you know, you can say, well, take me to this airport or take me to that airport. So the goal is not built into the system, they are taskable systems. And how do we make sure that this superintelligent system is tasked correctly with human interests as its fundamental objective? And this goes back to, you know, at least to Hume, who said, you know, you can't just tell what the objective is by looking at the world, right? That's the whole idea of the naturalistic fallacy. And so unless there's something which constitutionally obliges the superintelligent system to favor your interests, then it doesn't have to pay attention, even if it's great at perceiving what you want. Why does that force it to actually do anything about it? Well, it's certainly related. I think often when people hear the phrase value alignment, they think that the goal is to build an AI system whose values are aligned with those of humans. And I think that leads to two misconceptions. One is that it's the AI system is kind of adopting the values, right? So if you're a vegetarian family and you buy this domestic robot that's going to cook food for you, you want it to be a vegetarian. Even though it doesn't eat, you want it to have vegetarian values so that it only cooks vegetarian food. That's not the right way of thinking about it. The right way of thinking about it is you want it to understand what your values are, but you know, if your friend next door borrows it to do a barbecue, you know, with lots of ribs and steaks one weekend when you're away, that's fine, right? It's not going to have a real crisis of conscience about cooking ribs for the next door neighbor, because it's not adopting the values. It's simply learning to predict the preferences of ultimately, you know, all 7 billion of us, right? And we can all be different, and that's fine. It can maintain 7 billion preference models. I mean, Facebook already does, so that's fine. The other thing is that we absolutely do not expect the machines to have complete and correct models of the preferences of the people that it's on whose behalf it's working. You're always going to be dealing with fundamental uncertainty about the true preferences of the individual, and yet you still need to be useful. And one important point is that if you're uncertain about the individual's preferences, then it turns out that you're necessarily deferential to them, because you know that they know more about their preferences than you do, which means that if they want to switch you off, that's because you're about to do something that they don't like, even if you don't know that they don't like it, right? And so you're quite happy to be switched off. If you believe you know the objective perfectly, then any attempt to switch you off would just be a mistake, and therefore it should be prevented. And so there's this absolutely necessary mathematical connection between uncertainty about preferences and the deferential behavior of the machine. Yeah, so let me begin by explaining this idea of instrumental convergence or instrumental goals. So if I ask you to fetch the coffee, it's perfectly obvious to you that if you're dead, you can't fetch the coffee. So by asking you to fetch the coffee, I have given you an incentive to stay alive, right? So sometimes people say, oh, well, we just don't have to build in these instincts like self-preservation or, acquisitiveness or desire for power or those things. The point is, no, yes, you don't have to build them in. They're going to happen automatically as a consequence of machines having pretty much any objective at all. So, if I ask the machine to cure cancer, well, that's going to require a lot of money. So now you've given it the incentive to acquire lots of money, lots of computing power, to gain physical control over lots of potential experimental subjects, and so on. So, the bad consequences are not coming from the fact that we built in this will to power or all these atavistic tendencies that we think of humans as suffering from, but just these instrumental goals, the goals that are useful to have for pretty much any specific objective: information, money, computing power, and physical control. Right, all of these things are useful for pretty much all objectives. So the thing you then need to do is to make sure that the machine isn't just pursuing an objective like fetch the coffee as a single goal. This is its life's mission and nothing else matters. It has to understand, as a human does, that there's all kinds of other constraints and trade-offs in operation. So yeah, if you want to cure cancer, getting some research funding, but that doesn't mean taking over the whole world economy. Yeah, you may want to get some volunteers for clinical trials, but that doesn't mean injecting, tumor-causing materials into all 8 billion people on the Earth. Obviously humans don't need to be told that, but if you don't tell machines these things, they won't know them. And so either you need to put all these things in, or the machine needs to know that it doesn't know them, and therefore ask questions like, is it okay if I inject all humans with tumor-causing material or not? Okay, so the three principles, and I want to emphasize these are principles guiding how we do the research and design of the systems. They're not like things that the AI system has to consult at every instance and then follow some logic to decide what to do based on the principles, right? So it's not, right, they're not built into my positronic brain or anything. So the first principle is that the only objective of the machine is human well-being or satisfaction of human preferences. So in particular, you don't want anything else like self-preservation or any of those things. The second principle is that the machine is generally in a situation of not knowing what those are, what the human preferences are. So uncertainty about the objective that the machine is pursuing is fundamental. And then the third principle is what connects humans to the machine's understanding of preferences. It's the fact that human behavior provides evidence of human preferences. And this third principle, I think, is the one that's most difficult, because the connection between human behavior and human preferences is a complicated one, right? We believe that our behavior is sort of driven by what we want the future to be like, but we know that we're not particularly good at it. We make mistakes, we do things that we regret, we think in short-term ways and then mess up our long-term goals and so on. So when you observe human behavior, you have to sort of reverse engineer out all the imperfections, all the complications of our cognitive structure. And that's something that's very difficult to do. So Okay, number one, there is no single human utility function, right? So every human is entitled to their own preferences about what they want the future to be like. And let me be clear on this. When I say human preferences, I don't mean like, do you prefer plain pizza to pineapple pizza? I mean preferences between two, as it were, completely specified futures that include all the events that you could ever care about that would make you prefer one future over another. And that's a hypothetical construct, right? I can't even show you those two futures in detail, but you could maybe imagine that I could make you a 2-hour movie of each of them, and you could kind of watch that in full 3D sense around and sort of live that life. And for most pairs of futures, it would be pretty clear within the first few minutes which one you like best. And then there would be some where you might say, well, this is a summary of those two futures, but I still am not really sure which one I like best. Now, if that's the case, then I think we're already to the point where the AI system is unlikely to induce a catastrophe, because if it's understood your preferences at least up to that degree of precision, then we're probably out of the woods in terms of avoiding major disasters. Now, as I said, at any given point in the interaction between a machine and a particular human, there will still be radical uncertainty about the full human preference structure. And then there are some additional complications to do with the fact that your preferences are plastic, that they change over time. And we want to avoid the failure mode whereby the AI system simply changes your preferences to be easier to satisfy rather than helping you satisfy your real preferences. And certainly, wireheading is one example. So wireheading is the idea that if you give someone a button and a wire, and the wire connects to the pleasure centers of the brain, and this has been tested with animals up to the point of death, and with humans up to the point of exhaustion, and complete neglect of personal hygiene for 24 hours. We would just keep doing it, and probably we would keep doing it until we died as well. Why is that a bad thing, right? I mean, you are clearly expressing your preferences by pressing this button. This is because evolution has built into us this reward system, which is mostly helpful, right? Our dopamine system. It's mostly helpful in pursuing nutritious foods and avoiding pain and so on, reproducing. But it's not a perfect signpost for evolutionary fitness, and it's certainly not a perfect signpost for how we think humans should live in an advanced civilization. And so we've learned we have all these cultural constraints that keep our dopamine system under control, and we let our cognitive system do a lot more of the decision making. But it's we still have this these ways of shortcutting, and our dopamine system is still really strong. There are some species, apparently there's a species of sloth which is addicted to its food supply to such an extent that it doesn't bother reproducing anymore because it's so zonked out the whole time. Now, I don't know if this is really true, maybe it's an urban legend, but it seems like that species is going extinct because of its dopamine system being not quite aligned with reproductive fitness. And so one of the things that AI systems have to do is not just this sort of very gross shortcutting via the wireheading, but to help us avoid our general inability to act in our own best interests. Yeah, it's an interesting question that a lot of things that we kind of take for granted are just normal parts of civilized behavior. When you unpick them, and sociologists are good at this, right? They love to unpick normal behavior and say, okay, what's really going on? For example, the standard view, roughly speaking, in it feels like welfare economics, is that there's your personal well-being, like do you have adequate food, shelter, warmth, company, and so on, and then there's your other regarding preferences, like what do you think about, are you happy that other people are suffering, or are you unhappy that they're suffering? So what is the sign of your altruism coefficient, so to speak? And that's a fairly simple model, and obviously, at least it seems obvious that we want people to have a positive altruism coefficient, not a negative one, so that we don't want them to be sadists. But then you look at what are called positional goods. So positional good is a term from economics, which means a good that has not just intrinsic value, but it has value because of its relative quality compared to the goods that other people have. So not just that I have this nice shiny car, but I have a nicer, shinier car than my next door neighbor, right? And of course that sounds, an unpleasant kind of attitude to have. But then, your pride in winning a Nobel Prize is also, to some extent, well, I have this Nobel Prize and you don't, right? If everyone had a Nobel Prize, we wouldn't value the Nobel Prize very much. And people complain about this in preschool, where everyone gets the prize, that the prize becomes meaningless. And so the value of the prize is precisely as a positional good. And when the more you think about it, the more you realize, a big chunk of our self-esteem and our feelings of achievement and success and so on are really positional goods. And positional goods act exactly like sadism, meaning that they're sort of based on the difference between my intrinsic well-being and your intrinsic well-being. And so I can increase that difference by decreasing your well-being, right? I can be better off if you're worse off. And it's a negative altruism coefficient. So it's possibly something that we might want AI systems might gradually try to reduce in our society, because it has all kinds of negative side effects, right? It's really, you end up with a kind of a negative sum game that we're playing with each other. But that would be a huge change, right? And maybe we're just not ready for that, right? Maybe just our culture and upbringing and the whole way of thinking is around this notion of relative success, and it would be too much of a change to have that happen, to have that removed all at once. So it would have to be a very careful process to do that. Yeah, I think generally, that there's a term called preference autonomy, which comes from Harsanyi, who's an economist, he died a few years ago, but an economist at Berkeley. So his view, which is actually in conflict, I think, with a lot of the early utilitarians, is that what people prefer is entirely up to them. And you shouldn't be saying that they should prefer happiness, or that they should prefer wealth, or they should prefer long life or short life, or anything, right? It's just what people want. And as a zeroth order theory, that seems right. The drawback, of course, is that, well, what they prefer is, there's not something they're born with. It's not something that came down from heaven. It's the result of their upbringing, their peers, their social context, their culture. And so there's a whole bunch of processes that are already shaping human preferences. And AI systems can't help but shape human preferences. It's inconceivable that we could have, that we could give everyone an incredibly useful personal servant without changing the way they think about things, right? How do we make sure they don't all become spoiled and lazy, for example? And that's another important part of understanding what the right relationship is between humans and machines. A simple-minded view of preferences is that you have preferences for things like, how much income you have, how tidy your house is, what kinds of food you have in the fridge, and so on. But it's not just that, right? It's also, did you actually make that income, right? Is that dish that's in the fridge something that you personally cooked, as opposed to it just being in the fridge? So this notion of autonomy and personal struggle and sometimes failure and sometimes achievement, that's a really important component. So we have to make sure that the machines understand that and don't simply become this sort of all-encompassing care system that reduces us to an infantile mind state, which is what you see. So Wally, so in Wally, all the humans are on this big spaceship journey because the Earth has been messed up. And they're on it for generation after generation, and they gradually become completely enfeebled. They become obese. They can't even get up out of their lounges, and they're completely unable to run their own civilization. And that's a serious consideration because up to now, if you add up all the people who've lived and how much time they've spent learning what the previous generation knew so they could continue, it's about 1 trillion person years. And that's what we spent to keep our civilization going. And if we wanted to, we put a lot of it on paper, but the paper doesn't run our civilization for us, right? It has to get into the next generation's mind in order for our civilization to function. But that's no longer true, right? If we can put that into the minds of the machines instead of the minds of the next generation, we can run our civilization without all this effort of learning. And that will be pretty much irreversible. And I think that's what Wally is, in its subversive, cartoony way, showing. How we have the incentive. So the machines might say, this is not good for you, right? You need to know how to run your own civilization. Kind of the way that parents say, no, you need to tie your own shoelaces. I'm not going to keep tying them for you. But we just have, we are short-term thinkers and we're myopic, and so we may kind of override our own machine's advice and say, no, we want you to do this. We're going to design you to take over all these functions because it's not worth our while to spend 14 years in school learning to be a surgeon or learning to run the electricity grid or whatever, because machines are better at it. So at the risk of sounding even more productive, I actually think that the word values is the wrong word because it tends to connote morality, moral values. And when we talk about morality, we're usually talking about things that are moral dilemmas, difficult decisions where there is some difficult trade-off to be made, and sometimes it's self versus other. And that's not really the major concern. So another provocative way of putting it is that the machine could get all the moral dilemmas in the world wrong, whatever that means, because in some sense, if it's a dilemma, it doesn't have a wrong answer. But let's say it chooses the answer that you wouldn't choose on every single case. It's still not going to be catastrophic, because the moral dilemmas are precisely those where there are good arguments on both sides for why you should do one thing or the other. But a machine that just goes around chopping everyone's legs off for the fun of it, that's not a moral dilemma, right? There are no moral philosophy classes discussing whether that's a good idea or not, right? But a simple point: none of the self-driving cars that are currently under development know that human beings prefer to be alive. So we are a long way from having to resolve difficult moral dilemmas about test tube fertilization or whatever it might be. So and also when you say the word values, the first question people seem to ask, well, whose values? And or even, what makes you a well-off Western white male, entitled to put the values in? And the answer is no, I'm not putting the values in. The thing we're putting in is that machines should act on behalf of what humans want their future to be like. So if we think about this connection between underlying human preferences, if they exist, and I think that's also something that psychologists can help with, and behavior, that's sort of really, in one conception, that is our whole cognitive architecture, right? Our preferences are kind of the wellspring of our behavior, but then there's all of the learning, perception, decision-making, and so on that in the end produces the behavior. So if you had to say, well, we can't really make progress until we have that complete model, and then we can kind of invert it so that when we see the behavior, we can infer what are the underlying preferences of this person. That's a really ambitious long-term project, and we'd have to wait a long time before we had finished it, if that's what we have to wait for. So I think you have to look at what are the major deviations from rational behavior. And here I think there are things we can do. So for example, we know that human beings are myopic, right? So when Lee Sedol lost the game of Go to AlphaGo, right, he made a move that lost the game at some point, right? I mean, he made a move after which there was no possibility of winning. But did he do that on purpose? Right? If you thought he was rational, then you'd have to assume that he wanted to lose. But of course, we don't think that way. We think he's trying to win, but his computational limitations mean that he can't always do that perfectly. So it's perfectly obvious to us that people don't have to be perfectly rational, but you can still figure out what they want. The biggest deviation, I think, is that at any given moment when a human being is behaving, they're behaving within a very restricted context, right? So here I'm in the restricted context of I'm doing an interview. So, there are lots of other things that people can do, but none of them are even in my decision frame right now, right? I mean, I could set fire to the building and claim the insurance money, or who knows what, right? I mean, I could take my phone out and start trading stocks in the middle of the interview. But I'm in an interview, so there's only certain things that one does in interview, and then, and that interview itself is part of a larger commitment to this particular center and the research project and so on. So at any given moment, we're embedded in actually several concurrent hierarchies of commitments and activities. And if you want to understand what someone does in terms of their preferences, you have to understand what that hierarchy is, right? What are, that there are short-term goals within that particular decision frame, but those short-term goals exist because of a larger frame, and somewhere up there are the real underlying preferences about our long-term future. And we may not even be at all consciously aware of the connection between those. So for an AI system to understand what people are doing, even a system, a relatively restricted system that helps you with your calendar or something like that, then it needs to understand what are the activities you're engaged in, and sort of where are you right now in that subroutine, so to speak. And so I think this is something that psychologists can really help to study, right? What is the nature of this hierarchy of commitments? How does it vary across individuals? How do we pop in and out? When do we decide to abort one commitment and replace it with another? What's the control structure? and so on. So these are questions that can be really helpfully explored with real human beings. Yeah, so the Dr. Evil problem simply refers to the fact that even if we do design safe and beneficial AI that has all these nice properties, for some people there's no incentive to use it. And so Dr. Evil wants to take over the world. He doesn't want the AI paying attention to the preferences of all those other people. So he has an incentive to shortcut the kinds of safety catches, if you like, or to just bypass those issues in a development process, because he wants the capabilities of the AI system. And the failure mode is then, of course, that not that he would succeed in taking over the world, but that he would fail in the sense that he loses control of the AI system, and then the consequences are arbitrarily bad. And I don't have a very good answer for this problem, because there are a lot of Dr. Evils out there, some of whom don't even think of themselves as evil, but nonetheless they have a sense of a mission that doesn't brook any kind of objection. And we have a problem already with malware, and this would be malware on double super secret steroids. It would be just, a much worse problem. And why are we not having as much success as we might like with containing and preventing malware? Some people might describe it as a complete, utter catastrophe that's getting worse and worse. Partly because of the original design of the internet just didn't really think about security, authentication, traceability, all of those properties that we all wish we had. And partly because there are countries that have no interest in assisting with the process of cleaning up the internet. So I think there are good reasons to do this anyway, but if you wanted to sort of ward off the Dr. Evil problem with more intelligent AI in the future, solving the malware problem now by creating much stronger international cooperative agreements and forensic processes and policing would be a really good step. And most countries in the world and pretty much all corporations in the world would get behind this. The Somalia problem is based on a little story where you have a domestic robot who looks after your house, and you come home one day and you're really tired, you didn't have any time for lunch, and you're really hungry, and you ask your domestic robot, "What's for dinner?" And the robot says, "Well, I have something I have to tell you. There are people in Somalia who are dying of starvation, so I'm going to help them instead of you. So I'm leaving now, make your own dinner." And that's a consequence of building robots that are trying to satisfy the typical utilitarian recommendation of satisfying the sum of human preferences. And it can do the most good by helping the people who are in the worst off situation, where they can prevent them from dying, get them back on a positive track. That would be much more beneficial than just making you dinner when you could make it yourself. Now, the difficulty with that, you might think, wow, I'm really proud of that robot, but now I'm wondering why I shelled out $80,000 for it. Of course, you wouldn't buy it, right? So, and then if you didn't buy it, it wouldn't be, if you didn't buy the robot, it wouldn't be available to go and help people in Somalia anyway, so it would be kind of self-defeating. So the Somalia problem is, how do you design the incentives of the robot? So the first principle says we help with human preferences, but more specifically, okay, how exactly do you deal with the relationship between the preferences of the owner of the robot and the preferences of everybody else? You can't just satisfy the preferences of the owner, because then you have a robot that behaves in all kinds of antisocial ways, which gain a little bit for the owner. You know, maybe the robot even just steals money from people to give to the owner. You have to have some term for the preferences of other people, but if you really do treat everyone equally, then the robot won't be of any use to the owner. It'll go off and do good around the world. So presumably the degree of loyalty it has to the owner has something to do with the purchase price of the robot. Right? It sort of owes you at least that much, otherwise you won't buy it in the first place. That sort of seems right, but I think it's more complicated than that. You know, and maybe also, you know, if the world wants your robot to go around doing good, then maybe the world should cover some of the cost of the robot in the first place. So you might be able to get a subsidized robot, but understand that your robot may go off and do something more important for the public good from time to time. So we'll have to see how it works out, and you know, economists are good at solving these kinds of problems. So here's what I think about that. You know, as a practical matter, if I was a manufacturer of autonomous vehicles, I'm imagining the first liability trial where my car has made one of these decisions. And rather than having to defend to the jury why the car decided to run over the little old lady or the two school children in a pram, I'd much rather want to say, well, we implemented the policy that was stipulated by the democratically elected government. So I think that's how I would deal with self-driving cars and these life and death, or sort of death versus death decision making. But I think in a much more practical case, you know, I think the trolley problems might never arise in the next 100 years in practice. But problems like, okay, when you're in a period of high congestion, do you take the shortest route, which then causes more congestion on that route, or are you willing to take a longer route and maybe save some money, right? Maybe you get a lower toll or something like that, if that relieves congestion on the short route that some people need to get to work. So all those kinds of negotiations would be happening all the time, and how you set that up and how that's built into the price of the car or some kind of subscription service you have for route choice, or you know, that remains to be seen, but it'll be hopefully it'll give very flexible ways of adjusting to people's preferences, like, you know, no, this morning I really do need to get to work early, so I'm not taking that route, and so on. Well, so in the standard model, right, there's a definite objective, right? So standard model of AI is we make optimizing machinery and we just put in a definite objective. So it's a special case of the approach that I'm proposing, right? Where it's a special case where all the uncertainty in the second principle has been squeezed out and disappears. So now we have a point objective where the machine believes it knows for sure that this is the thing to pursue. And that can be okay in limited contexts with machines of limited capacity. So, you know, you might think, fine, if we're just writing a Go program, then the goal of Go program should be to win the game. Okay, you know, what could possibly go wrong, right? It's just, you know, it's just making moves on a simulated Go board, and that's it. But it's not quite it, right? AlphaGo is not that intelligent, right? Although it does a good job of learning to play Go moves, it's not doing what we do, right? We're intelligent beings, you know, we want food and reproduction and various other things. But through a very kind of indirect derivative of those goals, we also want to understand the universe. We want to, in fact, understand how our own brains are producing this behavior. And a sufficiently intelligent AlphaGo would also want to do that, in the hope that it might be able to gain a better understanding of what is the source of these other Go moves that keep appearing on the board. Why do they appear? How are they generated? How are my own moves generated, right? Just as how are my own thoughts generated by my brain? All those questions have utility for winning, which is AlphaGo's objective. Eventually, it will figure out that there is an outside world, larger than the Go board. It'll figure out that it's operating on some kind of device that generates all of these computations, and that there's some other entities out there, and then it can start messing with things, right? It can start communicating by forming patterns on the Go board, and maybe the other entity will see these, and then you can start a conversation. It's actually very hard with a machine of unlimited intelligence. It's very hard to imagine a narrow scope problem with a very simple goal like winning the game of Go that is still guaranteed to be safe. On the question of low probability, right? I've seen this argument, for example, that mathematically it's possible that a black hole could materialize in near-Earth orbit and swallow the world, but we don't spend a lot of resources worrying about that. And the natural response is, but if all the world's physicists were cooperating on a massive project to make that black hole appear in near-Earth orbit, wouldn't you ask them if that was a good idea? And then try and figure out if it was safe, and maybe if it's not safe, to prevent it. And that's the situation that we're in, that the world's AI community, the major governments in the world, the largest corporations in the world are all working towards the goal of creating human-level AI. I mean, it's stepwise, incremental progress, but it's actually, pretty rapid progress right now. So you could stand up there and say, actually, I know that all these governments, all these corporations, all these AI researchers who've been working on this for decades and decades are all wrong. That it's completely impossible, that there is no physically possible arrangement of atoms in the universe that could be more intelligent than a human being. Okay, if you believe that, but that's bad policy, I think, to stake the future of the human race on the correctness of that belief. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. So, the overpopulation on Mars argument, again, if the whole world were engaged in a project to move the human race to Mars, wouldn't it make sense to ask, what are we going to breathe when we get there? And that's in fact what people are working on, right? What is the carrying capacity of Mars? 0, right? So if you put one person on Mars, it's overpopulated. So the people who are working on creating a Mars colony are precisely worrying about overpopulation. They want to create life support systems so that the Mars carrying capacity is more than 0. And that's what we're doing. We're saying if we succeed, we're going to need to be able to know how to control these systems. Otherwise, we'll have a catastrophe. Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think it depends on how young and what kind of time scale. In the near and medium term, there's clearly going to be enormous demand for AI researchers, robot engineers, and so on. But the difficulty there is that there'll still be a high threshold for entry into these professions in terms of education, mathematical preparation, and so on. And the number of jobs is not going to be close to filling the gap if most of the jobs that we currently have go away. And a simple way of thinking is that we've used most of the human race as robots for the last 10,000 years or so. And now that period is coming to an end. And we have to have a different way of doing things. So if you think that, okay, most routine mental and physical labor will be done by machines, then the likely, what is the comparative advantage of human beings? Well, it's that they're human. That's the thing we have left. And there are things that humans want humans to do, including things like helping with bringing up children, having lunch, various kinds of coaching and inspiration and consolation, companionship, and maybe other kinds of, we might call these psychological services if you want. I mean, all of the current ways we have of talking about this, the caring professions, they all, they sound good from the point of view of the provider. Oh, you're a carer, that's great. But they sort of have this connotation of dependency for the recipient. That probably is not the right way to think about it. What we need to be able to do is to more think of this as almost like an engineering discipline, that we want psychology and the humanities to be a bit more like engineering, is that we have a lot of basic science on which we can build predictable methods and training programs to teach people those methods, just as we have for surgeons, right? We do a lot of basic science to support what surgeons do, and we train them, and when they fix your broken leg, it works, and that's great, and that's why they get paid. If most of the time it didn't work, we wouldn't pay them, and that's sort of the situation with a lot of these professions right now, these sort of softer professions, and that's just really just a consequence of, number one, the difficulty of the problem, that the human mind is really, really complicated. We don't know how to fix it very well compared to the body, and just the emphasis of our technological civilization, that we put resources and people into the hard sciences, the sciences that produce a cell phone, for example. We probably, if you sort of work back down the tree, maybe it's $1 trillion, maybe it's $10 trillion in research and development effort in many different disciplines to produce the cell phone. But we haven't put not even 1% of that into how do you make it possible for someone to have a rich and fulfilling life, right? And that science and that engineering and those professions are going to be the future.